The Giants will host the Falcons at MetLife Stadium in Week 3 on September 26th. To get more into Atlanta and what to expect from that team this season, we are now joined by the Falcons radio play-by-play announcer, none other than Wes Durham. Wes, you got Lance Medow and Jeff Feagles here on Giants.com, Big Blue Kickoff Live. Appreciate the time today. Hope you and yours are safe and healthy. How's everything on your end?
Pretty good. It's been a pretty quick off season, and it feels like it's going to get a lot quicker here with about a month and change to training camp for everybody, or most everybody else in the league. So, but plenty of new things in Atlanta to get used to as we work our way to the start of the year.
Absolutely, and that's a great starting point. Let's start with the newness right atop the team, and that is the fact that they do have a new head coach in Arthur Smith, who comes over from Tennessee, their offensive coordinator. I think a lot of people, Wes, are wondering, okay, well, what's the identity of this Falcons offense going to be? Is it going to resemble the run-heavy offensive approach in Tennessee with Derrick Henry? Are they going to capitalize more on some of the offensive weapons in the passing game? How would you best assess what you think this Arthur Smith offense is going to look like?
Well, I think if you're gonna visualize Tennessee, then I think you may be going up the wrong tree a little bit, because there's not anything about Atlanta's material that leads you to believe they don't have a big back. They don't have a Derrick Henry. They've had enough trouble running football in the last couple of years, and while they've done some things, certainly Chris Lindstrom and Caleb McGarry have been outstanding additions on the right side. Looks like Matt Hennessy will be the center going into the season now that they've let Alex Mack go. To me, Lance and Jeff, the idea here with Atlanta is I think you're going to see a lot more Matt Ryan. Obviously, I think throwing the ball, even with the trade of Julio Jones, is still going to be a premium. But they've got to find a way to run the ball better. I just don't think they can make as drastic a change to what Coach Smith did when he was in Nashville, for sure.
Well, certainly Mike Davis last year, filling in for Christian McCaffrey, did a decent job there in Carolina, and now with the Atlanta Falcons. And I agree with you. Any football team needs to run the football to be able to compete in the National Football League. But, the big thing that I'm looking at, and I'll hit this first because I think this is the big topic, is Julio Jones leaving the team and going elsewhere, and the drafting of Calvin Ridley a few years ago. Is he ready to step up, and who's going to be that outside guy to help him? The second question is, and I tell you what, you guys grab my guy, because and Lance will tell you that when we first started talking about the draft, Kyle Pitts was my man. I wanted him so bad, like a lot of other teams did. But talk a little bit about those two guys, and I think that's kind of where you're going with it, Wes, is that this offense is going to be a little bit heavy on the throwing the football around to these guys, and Russell Gage is another one.
Jeff, I'll take let me take the Julio Jones to Calvin Ridley transition first, because I think one of the things you have to remember about Julio, and when healthy, and I always have to precurse that. I mean, I have to say when healthy, because the last 2 years he's just not been very healthy. Now, has he played 24 ball games in the last 2 years? Yeah, roughly that number. But the reality of it is he's got to be at 100% to be the top 3 receiver that he was 5 years ago. When Atlanta went to the Super Bowl and he was making play after play, and Ryan was the MVP. But I think Calvin Ridley in the last 2 years has emerged in a way that I think has surprised a lot of people. I think his versatility and his durability have really, really developed nicely. And to answer your question, there's no doubt I thought Pitts was the go at 4 all along. I thought there was a lot of smoke being thrown. More of it from the West Coast and the Bay Area was being thrown than any place else. But I never felt like Atlanta was going to take a quarterback. I just didn't. And now, if the offer had been strong enough to give up 4, I think they would have done that. But once the San Francisco-Miami deal went down, I think the amount of money or the amount of inventory being swapped at that position, I think probably took Atlanta out of having to move the pick or getting anybody to get that neighborhood done. So Pitts was the go, and I always felt like he was the go, because I think he's a game changer. I really do. I think he's a guy that immediately causes a problem for the defense. Who do you put on him? Safeties aren't big enough. Linebackers are too slow. I mean, when you look at what he did and against who he did it, I don't know if there can't misses anymore in the National Football League, but I think he's going to be an impactful guy from day one. You mentioned Russell Gage on the other side. I think because of Jones's issues last couple of years, Russell Gage has gotten a lot out of the offense, and Matt Ryan's developed some confidence in Russell Gage. He's got to be more consistent. I think Calvin Ridley's ready to go. I think Kyle Pitts is ready to go, even as a rookie. And health will be his question. How does the first-year guy hold up to this? I still think you've got to look at guys maybe who are probably unknowns outside of the Atlanta camp, but have been here a couple of years. Olamide Zaccheaus, a kid out of Virginia who can play the slot. Ridley plays the perimeter. Then they can flip-flop. Depending on, and you guys know this, more and more we're seeing the nickel-based defenses now in the National Football League. Atlanta's got enough weapons to cause problems with nickel-based defenses. And then I'll go back to what you said, Jeff, about Mike Davis. His ability to run the ball is really going to be the equitable for what Atlanta does this year. If they can run it, honestly, just be serviceable running it, I think they've got a chance to return to form offensively. But Pitts is a game changer, especially in the red zone where Atlanta struggled the last couple of years for sure.
Wes, I feel with the arrival of Pitts, maybe one guy that gets overlooked a bit is Hayden Hurst, who was on the team last year as their other tight end. And the reason I bring him up, as you mentioned, you can't look at Tennessee and figure that Atlanta's going to duplicate that. But with that being said, Arthur Smith, I thought, did a really nice job utilizing the tight ends in Tennessee. Jonnu Smith, who now is in New England, and he had a few other young guys. How do you see the dynamics playing out between Kyle Pitts and Hayden Hurst and the various roles they may play within this passing game?
Well, I think Hayden Hurst is more of your conventional guy, Lance. I think he's the guy who's hand on the ground, quote-unquote, the willing blocker. I think that Kyle Pitts is more, golly, and I hate to do this, I think he's more the Kelsey type. I think he's the guy in space that we've all kind of fallen in love with at tight end here in the last couple of years, right?
Sure.
I think that's the guy that Kyle Pitts is going to be. I think Kyle Pitts is he's the guy like Jonnu Smith that can run, catch, play in the space, line him up wide. That's what Pitts is. And look, we were fortunate in my career broadcasting the games here to have Tony Gonzalez and the back third of his career. And Tony Gonzalez had a tremendous impact, and you saw his presence. Even when the ball wasn't even thrown to his side of the field, Tony Gonzalez used to take a guy and a half with him. Kyle Pitts probably won't take a guy and a half with him early. But if Jeff and I are right in our estimation of what he could be, it won't be the end of the year before a guy and a half's on it. Because that'll open up the rest of the field for Atlanta. And that's what Gonzalez did. And when Gonzalez and Jones were together, it was a wrap. And the reason it was a wrap was because you had guys that literally could not cover the field, and, oh, by the way, then you'd run it. So that's kind of where Atlanta's got to get to. Without Jones healthy on the field, without the real threat at tight end, Atlanta was kind of forced to play in a box a little bit in the last couple of years. And that, at the end of the day, probably spelled as much demise for Dan Quinn and Thomas Dimitroff as anything else.
Well, Wes, I'll tell you what, the Giants, they play the Atlanta Falcons in the third week of the season. We'll find out sooner or later if they've got 1.5 guys on Kyle Pitts or not.
So I think you're right. And it's interesting because, and you guys have looked at schedules, I'm sure, of other teams as well. The way Atlanta opens with Philly, Tampa, and then New York in the first 3 weeks before Washington comes to the Mercedes-Benz Stadium, Atlanta's going to have a pretty good feel of where they are after 3 weeks or 4 weeks for sure. And with this new coach, new staff, new administration, then they played the Jets in London in week 5. I mean, by the time they get to mid-October and the bye week, which is really early for them, Arthur Smith and Terry Fontenot are going to have a whole lot of tape to look at and say, okay, what's working, what's not working, and can we evaluate kind of in the middle third of the season? And with 17 games this year, that week 5 bye or week 6 bye, that's a really, really early bye for a young football team. That means a long, long second half of the season, if you will.
Well, Wes, real quickly, to stay on the offensive side, we have not mentioned Matt Ryan at all. I feel, as far as health and age, and, the team certainly has done a great job of surrounding him with some playmakers. What's your take on Matt Ryan? What have you seen this offseason? And, what do you see going forward into the 2021 season for this young man? Well, he's not young anymore, the old guy.
Well, no, not young anymore for sure. By his own admission, too, which is kind of funny because he has to admit he's aging, which he doesn't want to do. But you know what, Jeff? He's always been a guy that when you doubt him, and a lot of people spent the last year doubting him, and yet he threw, for his 10th straight 4,000-yard season, right? I mean, the guy is one of the best quarterbacks statistically the NFL has. And I would say this, I think he's sometimes really unappreciated by the general football public, and in particular in his own town at times.
Sure.
I expect him to have a great year. I really do. I think he is okay with the culture changes. Yeah, and you know what I mean, Jeff. There are guys who play in this league that when there's a front office change or a coaching change, it can go south pretty quick. And I would say you're kind of seeing that in Green Bay a little bit. But for Matt, he adjusted to this, and I think part and parcel because he was never the bona fide starter, even if you go back to his college days. When Tom O'Brien was coaching him at Boston College, he went in and out of the lineup a lot. And so, he never kind of gets comfortable. He always wants to grind and play with the chip on his shoulder. And I think he'll have a really good year. For my sake and his sake, I kind of hope they've gotten the offensive line figured out. Now, whether it's going to be Andrews, Willie White, however the left guard situation shakes out, is going to really be critical to whether Atlanta can have the kind of year offensively I think they want to.
We're talking with Wes Durham, the Falcons radio play-by-play announcer, and I want to piggyback off of that point, Wes, before we shift gears to the defensive side of the ball, because, first of all, I wholeheartedly agree with you. I think he is very much overlooked, and I think the one aspect of Matt Ryan's career that doesn't get enough credit, and we saw that firsthand here with Eli Manning, is the durability. The guy's played at least 14 games in all 13 of his seasons, and you know what? That, to me, is important. Be accessible on the field before we talk about anything else. But the fact that you brought up the offensive line, and Matt Ryan's been sacked at least 41 times, and there's been some seasons, as you could attest to, where they haven't necessarily had that dominant established run game. So, how much really, when you look at the offensive side of the ball for the Falcons, that it's not so much on Matt Ryan this year, their ceiling, but it's really about whether or not the pieces around him can come together within the early stages of the year?
Lance, it's the reason. I mean, it's not, it's the reason of the downfall, in all honesty. I mean, he's had statistically, productive years. Yeah. And people keep coming back to the quarterback. The inability to run the ball is not Matt Ryan's fault.
Sure.
It's funny because people will get so fired up about it and say, well, we got to get better quarterback play. No, you got to run the ball better. I mean, you guys see it in New York. Your best teams in New York. I mean, I followed the Giants as a kid because I grew up a Carolina fan with Lawrence Taylor playing for the Giants. The best Giant teams, the best football teams anywhere, are teams that run the football at the professional level. I mean, yeah, you can throw it around the yard. And, I do the games with Dave Archer as a former quarterback, and he loves nothing more than to see guys sling it. But the idea you can't run the ball, that's a death nail in the NFL. And Atlanta's like everybody else. You got to be able to run it. And to be honest with you, look at Tampa Bay. For all the greatness Tom Brady showed you during the year, and at the end of the day, what happened in the Super Bowl? They ran the ball with Leonard Fournette.
Yeah.
And I think you're exactly right. Matt Ryan gets overlooked part and parcel because of around him, not because of him. It's what goes on around him on the offensive side.
Well, we're gonna switch sides to the defense. Again, another new coach on the staff for the Atlanta Falcons, and Dean Pease, a guy that if you've been around football a while, he's got a heck of a pedigree for the guys he works for. That being Nick Saban and Bill Belichick. Wes, talk a little bit about what he's going to bring to this Atlanta defense. I know he likes to get after the quarterback in many, many ways. And what are you hearing this offseason about some of the schemes that he'll be implementing in the 2021 season for the Falcons?
Well, I think like a lot of people, Jeff, they're going to get to the more of the 3-3-5, 4-2-5, right? I think that's just kind of where this league is moving. The four-man front is going to be, kind of amplified with the big nickel and that kind of look defensively. I think Dean will move guys around. I think that's one of the reasons, Arthur Smith was able to kind of coax him out of retirement. There are a lot of people in Nashville who've told me this is the most important offseason acquisition that Arthur Smith and Terry Fontenot have made, because when he was in Tennessee, he was a game changer. I think he's got a young secondary, A.J. Terrell, obviously second year, Isaiah Oliver, third, fourth year guy. Eric Harris comes over from the Raiders. You've got some other guys, older guys, Markevius Mingo from Chicago. But on the whole, Grady Jarrett is a linchpin up front. You hope Dante Fowler can return to form. He took a pay cut to stay here. Deion Jones is a Pro Bowl linebacker. Atlanta needs to see some real productivity on that side of the ball. And Dean Pease, in my mind, is a guy that can really deliver it.
Yeah, I think Dean Pease could be a tremendous X factor, to your point, based on what he did in Tennessee. And the numbers, as you alluded to, Wes, were not pretty last season, specifically in the secondary. They allowed an NFL worst 294 passing yards and 34 touchdown passes, which was also third worst. But as much as people want to focus on the secondary, I'm wondering whether or not the play up front in getting after the quarterback is going to be maybe a determining factor. And I don't want to maybe over-exaggerate a bit, but I feel like, Wes, whenever I talk about the Falcons' pass rush, I've got to go back to maybe when John Abraham was there last in terms of, right, when they had that presence that you felt opposing teams had to scheme and say, we better double this guy up or else we're going to be in trouble. And I almost feel like that's been lacking since John Abraham, which, as you can mention, it's been quite some time. So how important is it for somebody to emerge up front to create some matchups or X factors for the Falcons in terms of getting after the quarterback?
It's not imperative. It's critical. It's John Abraham was a double-figure guy. Vic Beasley almost got there a couple of years ago. Atlanta, Dwight Freeney, when he came here at the latter stages of his career, was a guy who almost got double figures in limited time. Since Freeney left here, in all honesty, there's not been consistent pass rush. Beasley had moments. It didn't end well. But since Abraham, you're right. They have not really had a Pro Bowl get-after-you defensive end year in and year out. I think they were hoping that maybe Fowler could be the guy. And again, he had a game here and a game there, but they need to find a way. If you were to ask longtime Falcon fans, Lance and Jeff, what the biggest, void is defensively, it wouldn't be linebackers. They've had Pro Bowl linebackers. They've had Pro Bowl guys in the secondary. It's cats that get after the quarterback. And it's not, I've been doing the games. This will be 18 years this fall. And, I can count on one hand the number of guys I've seen registered double-figure sack years. And that's something that has to change. Now, can Dean Pease line it up in this new world we're living in of spread influenced in the NFL to make something happen? Yeah, possibly. But it's going to be interesting. And I think Fowler is a key guy to keep an eye on. I think Jones is a key guy to keep an eye on. It's going to be interesting to kind of watch this team. And that's why I spoke of the schedule earlier. When you think about it, think about the teams they're going to play in the first few weeks and kind of how that's going to sit. It's going to be an interesting start. And then you get that bye week after London to kind of examine where you are through 5. Turn around, we got 12 more to play this year, guys. Not 11 more, 12 more games to play after the bye week. That's a college season in most.
Yeah, that's a tough one. That's a real tough one. I know from experience, and with just 16 games, you kind of hope that you get that bye somewhere in the middle of the season. It doesn't always work out that way, but for players to be able to have a bye that early and then got 12 games to go with no break, that's going to be a tough one. Wes, let me talk to you a little bit about Dean Pease. I feel like I'm just infatuated with him because he's just done such great work with Baltimore when he was there, and of course with Tennessee. I know what he likes to do, and one of them is to confuse the quarterbacks by some of the schemes he does. And with that, and we talked a little bit about Grady Jarrett and Dante Fowler getting after the quarterback, going to put a lot of pressure on that defensive backfield to be opportunistic. That's one of Lance's favorite words. It took me 2 years to figure out how to say it consistently. But I feel like that's kind of one thing that Dean Pease will require from his secondary is to be ball hawks and very opportunistic.
Yeah, no doubt. And I think that's where, we talk about the 4-2-5 or the 3-3-5, Jeff. I think that's where, they're going to lean on Oliver and A.J. Terrell. I think Eric Harris and Gerard Harmon, who are veteran guys that come over in free agency, are going to have to play bigger roles. Maybe in Harmon's case, as you guys know, he was kind of a role guy in New England and a role guy in Detroit. He's going to have to play a bigger role here. Atlanta let Keanu Neal, DeMonte KZ, and Ricardo Allen go out the door on free agency because of their salary cap implications. And so those are 3 performing players in the secondary that have to be accounted for. And, to be honest with you, that's one of my bigger concerns. The offensive line continuity in the middle of the field in the defensive secondary, if you will, the nickel, the single, the strong and the free are going to be the biggest areas that I'm going to keep an eye on. Even in the 3 preseason games, which sometimes people say are meaningless, but in Atlanta's case this year, could really be, game experience to construct some depth about certain ways they're going to line up against certain packages, I think, from a personnel standpoint.
Well, Wes, my favorite word may be opportunistic, as Jeff mentioned. His favorite term is special teams because he's a former punter. So I guess we have to at least cover that aspect, especially since I think it's meaningful for the Falcons because normally we're not talking about the kicker, but my goodness, Younghoe Koo was essentially a weapon for the Falcons last season. And the other addition I really liked is they brought in Cordero Patterson, who's been a very strong return man during the course of his career. So how much do you think that facet could maybe help make up for what you were talking about, the questions up front on the offensive line as well as on the defensive side of the ball?
Well, Koo became their biggest scoring threat last year, and unfortunately a lot of it was around the red zone plan, and that's an issue, right?
Yeah.
You got to be able to get touchdowns, not field goals. But he also showed a really high percentage at distance, which I think certainly is going to help Atlanta a ton if he can maintain that. And I think it was good for Younghoe to have kind of his journey validated, to be honest with you guys. I mean, high school football player in Jersey, went to Georgia Southern, kind of a journeyman, kicked in the old spring league, if you will, here in Atlanta, and it didn't end well there. But, kickers are like big men in the NBA. Sometimes it takes a few years to mature. Here's what I'll say about Cordell Patterson. If Dean Pease is the most important acquisition in the offseason, the most versatile acquisition in the offseason is going to be Cordell Patterson, who took the minimum to come here. And I think one of the reasons he's come here is because I think he's going to touch the ball in a lot of ways.
Sure.
Certainly is going to be huge. But I think you're going to see him, and you guys will know what I mean by this, because I think the Giants played the Packers when they were in the Ty Montgomery laboratory experiment that time. Where Ty Montgomery was touching it like 2 or 3 different ways a ball game in Green Bay.
Yeah.
That's where I see Cordero Patterson, because when you think about what Arthur Smith did, and Jeff, you mentioned it earlier, bigger backs, bigger line, tight end play, all that. Well, at some point, it can't be Calvin Ridley and Kyle Pitts and run it conventionally with Mike Davis. You're going to have to sneak a guy into space, find the one-on-one you can win, and who better to use than a wise old vet who's got a little bit of speed, right? And I think there's where Patterson kind of fits what's going to happen for the Falcons offensively in certain down and distance.